This is the Intuitive Leadership Mastery Podcast. What would it take for you to double your profits and half your stress with your intuition? Learn how with your host, Michael Light.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Jordan Greenhall, 20-year entrepreneur, victor in many successes in business, crashes when it didn't work out because he didn't perceive what was happening in the world. And we're going to have an amazing conversation about how you can perceive what's really going on at a much deeper level than you're used to. And Jordan wrote an article that went viral called Situation Assessment, and I've linked that in the show notes. And I really recommend reading it and digesting it. It might take a few goes to digest it because there's so much deep information in there. And we're going to talk about Jordan's creative process and how he uses his intuition, but how he also uses his rational mind to make that more effective. And also we're going to look about if you're competing with other businesses, how do you get in their OODA loop, what that is and why it's important. And we're also going to look at memes and why those matter in your business. And if you aren't using memes in your business, you are not going to win in business in this century. We're also going to look at why fighting the last war is a mistake in your business. And also that there are some culture wars going on now that could totally change the whole business environment and affect what you need to do to succeed right now. So welcome, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's a lot of stuff we're going to talk about.
Well, we'll do our best. And, what would it take to cover all those things in depth? As I said earlier, we're going to take people from the shallow end of the swimming pool. We are going to go down to the deeper end of the swimming pool. We are going to hope that none of the listeners drown at the deeper end. But, there are some show note lifeboat belts there to save them if they, get a little lost. But I like to take people deep. So let's do that.
Great. It's going to be fun.
So you have some really creative ideas, but how on earth do you come up with these amazing concepts that you have?
Well, you mentioned the notion of being able to talk about the intuitive method and the analytical or the rational method, and I use both. As I mentioned to you earlier, I was raised and trained in the analytical and mathematical rational method, but I'm fundamentally intuitive, and it's only been in the past decade or so that I've really been able to hone and honor the intuitive channel. And so what ends up happening for me is there's a constant back and forth of trying to figure out different ways and techniques to allow the intuitive to speak, to be heard, to emerge in the way that it does. As you know, it's not it's never obvious, it's never straightforward. But then when it does, to really be able to sort of feel into what is actually happening. And then what I do is I clothe it with a set of principles and concepts that I am constantly gathering and refining through the rational channel. And I should mention, by the way, this notion of principles and concepts I think is particularly useful because a principle is at a high enough level of generality that you can then use it to make sense of something that is coming from the intuitive channel. Maybe we can talk about that in more concretion in a little bit, but that's how I do it. And I find, by the way, that one of the best ways for me to suss out the things that are happening intuitively is in dialogue. That just having a conversation with somebody will just begin to bring things up, and it will surface as almost a synchronicity, a serendipity in the dialogue. And then I'm like, okay, there it is. That's the thing that I was trying to make sense of, that just somehow sharing in words with another consciousness helps clarify these things.
So that might be talking with another business friend about the ideas you're getting from your intuition. It might be writing it down in an article and sharing it out with people. Could be making a video and sharing it. Many different ways to share and get feedback and get greater clarity. And just by the act of having to share what's come to you, I think for me, it helps clarify the ideas in my own head.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you're right. Even creating a video with the intention of sharing it. Like if you create a video without the intention of sharing it, I don't think it works. But even if you don't actually get it broadly shared and very little feedback, the intention of sharing it just requires a level of a demeanor, an attitude, and a level of discipline that helps clarify those more subtle elements.
So this is both a practical strategy, But it also comes back to, we want to hear these messages and that we get from our intuition to improve our business. And by taking action, whether it's going to have a conversation or making a video or whatever, it somehow makes the intuition pay attention more and give us even more information. Whereas if we do nothing and just sit on it, it seems the intuition almost shuts down and stops giving us the information so much.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I even just extend that in the case of this article that you mentioned, you also get the benefit of the larger collective intuition, or the feelings of a lot of other people can then actually help point you in areas where your intuition may be screaming at you, but you then get the signal back. So when I wrote this article, I had no sense or intent of more than a couple of hundred people reading it, maybe 1,000 at the outside. But instead, it went viral. 100,000 people or more have read it, and as a consequence, that told me that there was something there that was more intense than I had anticipated, but also then flowed a lot more energy and attention back at me, which changes the state of what I can do in the world.
I love that. And you mentioned someone, Ms. Roy, I'm not quite getting her first name, who's talked about what reality really is and how this applies to sharing new ideas we get from our intuition. Can you tell us a little about that and what that concept is?
Sure. So her name is Bonita, like Little Bonnie, Bonita Roy, and she has been thinking about deep metaphysical questions very powerfully for a while. And the way she described it to me is that it is better to think about reality as a continuum from the infinitesimal, the really, really not very much real, all the way to the infinite, that which is quite significantly real. And the continuum is measured by the degree to which something is shared. So in your own sense, there are going to be things that you will intuitively feel, but they're very vague and very distant. And you could just barely even hold on to them for a few moments. And so those are things that are not very real. In the act of just being able to tune more clearly into them and kind of play with them and start to sort of get a better sense of what is trying to show itself, that is an internal intuitive process of realizing that, which is to say literally making it more real. And then what ends up happening is that as you build techniques to be able to share that more broadly, like the moment where you can share it outside of yourself with another consciousness, that's a massive increase in the realization of that thing. And then if it becomes shared even more broadly, like say in the case of this article where 100,000 consciousnesses are now beginning to act on it, it's a significant realization of it, and then you can kind of go further and further and further.
Now that's great philosophically, but let's apply that to business. If you've got a marketing idea or a product or service and you're positioning it a certain way, if you're the only person in the world who gets your product, no one's going to buy it. But if you can get thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to get the idea, like, why is an iPhone the thing to get, right? Because an iPhone's just a phone and a computer, right? But really, it has a whole bunch of belief systems about why you should get an iPhone and not an Android that get people to take action. And that changes the reality. So it's not just Steve Jobs thinking, oh yeah, iPhones are cool. He's managed to convince millions of people iPhones are cool, they're useful, I've got to have one. And that is a genius trick to pull. And that's how changing reality makes profits.
And what I'd like to do is actually take advantage of one of the other topics that we wanted to talk about, which is the nature of different kinds of technology frameworks, and maybe the notion of memes, and do them all at once. Because
now you mentioned that word meme. That's spelled M-E-M-E. It's sort of like gene. And this is critical for modern business. So tell us what a meme is and why it matters.
Okay, so a meme is conventionally thought of as being an idea or an artifact. I'll actually very specifically call it a shareable piece of culture. So it might be a song, it might be an image, it might be a GIF, an animated GIF, but it's a shareable piece of culture is a meme. And by the way, a scientist named Richard Dawkins is the person who actually conceptualized the idea, and he was trying to specifically talk about what is the intellectual or idea equivalent of genes. Ideas having sex are memes.
So basically it's an idea in someone's head or a thought in someone's head that then gets replicated to other people's heads. So it might be a popular song that they're singing, and then it goes in your head and you keep singing and sing it and you share it with other people. Or it might be the meme that iPhones are cool and you need to get one. Or it might be
it might be the way that somebody holds a cigarette in their hand and sucks in the smoke and blows it out. And it might be a cultural artifact in the shape of behavior, or it might be a particular color of car that is cool this year. And so it's actually a little bit more abstract than just something that can be expressed semantically. It is the stuff that we humans observe in our environment that we then use to change our behavior in relationship to other humans, including ourselves.
So if we think of humans as having these things in their heads that cause them to behave differently, and let's call that software just for the purpose of this, the memes are kind of like the pieces of the software that get passed around between the humans and cause them to behave differently. And why is that important in business?
Well, I think the way of thinking about memes and being able to have access to the frame of shareability and genetics is particularly helpful right now because effectively none of us are Apple. And what I mean by that is if you think the way you're going to go get your ideas out in the world is that you're going to buy a Super Bowl ad and get a lot of attention in that fashion, you're probably wrong. But in a contemporary environment of social media, the power of a Super Bowl ad is catastrophically declining. And the real way to go about getting people to care about and engage with what you're doing is in the fine art of memetics, which is to find ways to craft and shape the essence, the importance, the value, the sense and value of the thing that you want to have shared in a fashion that even a very small group of people, and hopefully over time a much larger group of people, connect with. And for the reasons of their own, decide that they want to share it, and even better, to add value to it and share it. And then you've got something very powerful. So the beauty of that is it's free.
Wow. So this is free promotion for your business idea or the mission you have for your tribe or whatever it is, change you're trying to achieve in the world, whether it's making profit or getting people to change their behavior, which usually the two go together. And
right. And the old-fashioned marketers used to call it word of mouth. That's a sort of a very cardboard way of talking about what we're talking about.
Right, but marketing's moved beyond word of mouth. You know, now we have all kinds of, you know, different advertisements, different copy, you know, content marketing, press, you know, PR manipulation, you know, the dark arts of copywriting. But this memetics is an actual scientific theory of why this works and how it works. Is that right?
That's correct. So it combines, so for example, the dark arts of copywriting, you can either get there through trial and error. You could just learn it through this sheer practicality of trying to see what works and what doesn't work. Or you can tap into the various disciplines of cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, human motivation, and understand why those things work. And of course, if you can jump to the end and get a much firmer grasp on why certain kinds of ideas are grasped and shared with certain kinds of energy and motivation, then you're able to leap way ahead of the game.
So that lets you, you know, I think we've all experienced this. Sometimes we want to get our product out into the market and there's traction and everyone wants to share it and use it. And other times it seems like we're pushing a noodle from the wrong direction and nothing's happening. Mm-hmm. And this helps explain the difference. Indeed.
Yeah. And you know, one of the key ideas, one of the key motifs is you know, the world wants to hear what the world wants to hear, and that's going to change based upon the state of the world. So, for example, if I had written my article a year ago, I probably would have gotten about 1,000 people to read it. But as of November 2016, this particular kind of idea and this particular framing of that idea, so both the way it's being told and the thing that it's talking about, suddenly has a whole lot of attention that's ready to interact with it. And that, of course, is crucial. Timing matters. I don't know how many times and how many different kinds of businesses you've been involved in, but the degree to which timing matters is actually becoming more and more and more because our ability to force the universe, force the world to listen to us is decreasing.
So, you know, and that's that's coming back to that phrase, the zeitgeist, what's happening in society and, what is the right time? And how can you tell what the right time is? Does intuition help with that at all? Or?
Well, I think in point of fact, intuition is the only thing that could really help, because quite often the things that change in the zeitgeist are things that we can't actually make any sense of. That's the idea of the zeitgeist, or the geist part of zeit. It's happening at a level where our conscious, semantic, rational mind, by the time we've made sense of it, it's already too late. And I'll kind of give you an example. I actually had a business. It was a public company in the 2006, 2007 timeframe, and I began to notice a number of conversations happening among people in the financial world, bankers, that were troubling, but I didn't have any expertise. My rational mind didn't understand finance. I didn't understand the languages like inverting yield curve that they were using, but my intuitive mind and my body were noticing that they were very nervous. And if I had just been able to be more effectively tuned into that and started being able to say, hey, something clearly important is happening here, what might that impact might that have on my business, I would have been able to be more effectively prepared for the financial crisis that they were aware of, or at least they were themselves intuitively aware of, which, of course, made a massive difference in my business and everybody else's business.
Oh, yeah. I mean, fortunes were made and lost in that crisis. So if you were able to pick up the timing on that, you'd have done great, or protected yourself from total wipeout.
And the key is it's in the water, it's in the air. You'll be tuning into it at the intuitive level. It's happening right now. Everybody is feeling like something is going on, but we can't name it yet. And so the process of being able to allow those feelings to point you, at least, give you just allow yourself to allocate your attention to the things that your intuitions are pointing yourself towards, and not try to hold too tightly, because the thing that holds tightly is the thing that's becoming obsolete.
I love that. If you're holding on too tightly to some business model or way of doing things, or you're used to making money through print ads in newspapers, and then social media comes along and you don't do anything, you're going to have problems in your business.
Yeah, you will be dead in some time.
So people who want to learn more about memes, I'm going to suggest a book called The Meme Machine by Susan Blackwell as a good introduction to that. You got any other resources you think are good, or?
I'm afraid that is not an area of my expertise. Almost every idea I have is bespoke or stolen, but I don't have I don't read a lot of sort of business-oriented books.
Well, I guess you're a good meme replicator then.
I am.
And that's a great skill to have. The person who spreads the meme is the person who gets rewarded, not necessarily the person who invents the meme.
It's actually the second or third upregulator is the one who seems to get most of the attention right now. But that may be just the nature of the environment that we're in. Certainly the person who invents the meme rarely gets the reward.
Yeah. So, we talked earlier that, if you're fighting the last war in your business, if you're using old technology when there's a phase shift in technology, that, you're not going to win. Tell us a bit more about that and how the phrase, the medium is the message, is actually a really important business concept.
All right. Wow. Okay. So that's very powerful. So it behooves us to take a little bit of time to get it right. This is actually, in my experience, shockingly uncommonly held and very deep. So the metaphor of fighting the lost war, for anybody for whom that makes any sense, I think is quite useful, because we've seen it happen over and over again. So we can just use the classic example of the Maginot Line in World War II. So the First World War was a big deal, and people worked really, really hard to figure out how to be very effective at winning the First World War. And so techniques, technologies, processes, methodologies, concepts, and frameworks went through a very rapid iteration process at the actual edge, right? Because getting it wrong killed you. And they got good at it, right? So then they became experts at fighting World War I. And so what they did is they formalized that knowledge for the French in particular, in this thing called the Maginot Line, which is the best trench ever made. Unfortunately,
And it was more than a
entire
trench. Just so
set of
people know, they spent billions of dollars building this Maginot Line. And it was supposed to be the impregnable Star Wars of the 1930s that would stop the Germans ever invading ever again.
Exactly. It was the categorical answer to the problem of trench warfare. But unfortunately, what the Germans did is they just obsoleted trench warfare completely. And a number of different technical innovations were part of that obsolescence of the old approach. The invention of the aircraft as a tactical weapon, the invention of armored warfare and the speed at which gasoline-powered tanks could run, and the invention of radio and the ability for tactical troops to be able to communicate fluidly and change where they were going and their coordination without having to be next to each other. Right? Those three in particular changed the state of the game. It was a different game. And so what ended up happening is that the French had become exceptionally good at winning a game that the Germans weren't even playing. And the Germans were playing a new game entirely, which completely obsoleted the old game. Now, this sort of thing happens all the time. And the Marshall McLuhan, who is a Canadian philosopher, had this phrase called the medium is the message. And what he means by that is that when you've got something like, let's say, television, which is best understood as the idea of broadcast audiovisual medium. Broadcast meaning one person creates a broadcast. We don't all have TV broadcast towers. There's a couple of them, 2 or 3. And it conveys audiovisual information. So it doesn't convey smell or texture, just those pieces. Once you have that as the form of medium that you're using, then a whole bunch of kinds of things are going to be given an opportunity to spread. A bunch of kinds of memes are suddenly going to be flourishing, kind of like the jungle. You'll have all sorts of things that flourish in the jungle and don't flourish in the desert. The television is a niche for a whole bunch of different kinds of memes. But then when you shift the technical framework from broadcast audiovisual to interactive digital, right, which is what now the internet and all the different sort of children of the internet, like mobile internet, have created. This doesn't just mean that it's not a linear, a simple transition, like from black and white television to color television is a simple transition. From broadcast audiovisual to interactive digital is equivalent to the shift from the jungle to the desert. And a whole different ecosystem is going to be selected for. And if you're the kind of plant that requires a lot of rainfall, like the jungle plant, and you're moving into the internet, into the desert, you're going to die. On the other hand, if you're exceptionally good at thriving and surviving in the nature of the medium that you're in, then you will naturally thrive. And so being able to tune into that, which, by the way, that kind of transition, again, is the sort of thing that the rational, conceptual mind just can't grasp, because the concepts that we build are actually based upon the medium in which those concepts are generated. Only the intuitive channel realistically can actually begin to have some sense of tuning into what this transitionary threshold looks like. And then, of course, the rational mind comes back behind it and begins to iterate and experiment and learn.
Now, I want to I think that is an incredible concept, and it applies to business, because these shifts in not just technology, but also organizational and societal shifts, because one of the shifts the German army made that helped them win the Blitzkrieg against France at the beginning of the Second World War was they had a different organization. They empowered lower level officers to make decisions on the fly in the field without having to go all the way up the hierarchy. So there were technological things, but there were also organizational shifts, and that applies to business too, and lets some businesses win and others lose because they have identified the new environment, the new technology, the new organizational ways of dealing with things, and they are leveraging that. And their opponents are fighting the last war, and they don't have a chance,
This is quite exactly right.
And here's the other thing that, as we go swimming out deeper into the swimming pool, the deeper water, these changes in our society with technological changes and organizational changes and belief changes, they're not like happening on a, click, every 10 years there's a change. They're happening faster and faster.
Right.
So you can't, just sit there and say, oh, well, no, we've made the change for this decade. We don't need to change our business anymore. Those changes are happening every 6 months now, and then it's going to be every 4 months, and then it'll be every month.
Yes, this is, it's an entire discipline in the Silicon Valley, the folks who have so far been the most successful at doing this, specifically trying to figure out how does one deal with accelerating change. Because during the 19th century and most of the 20th century, the slope of the curve of accelerating change was far enough apart that we could largely pretend the change was happening in sort of decade-long cycles. So we could pretend that was the case. But as you say, now that the slope of the curve is getting steeper and steeper relative to our agency, when change is happening in 6-month cycles, we really have to begin formalizing entire approaches around what accelerating change itself actually means.
And to me, this is one of the key reasons why we need to use our intuitive mind along with our rational mind in business, because the rational mind is great at dealing with changes that only happen every 10 years. You only have to rebuild your factory every 10 years. That is not true anymore. You've got to rebuild your processes every 6 months, every month. It's always changing. And the only way you can tell is by pulling in your intuitive thoughts as well as your rational thoughts.
And yeah, this is absolutely correct. I mean, we might even go a little bit further and talk about the fact that you have to begin building your organizational framework around that sense of intuitive sensibility.
I think that is really important. It's not just that someone in the quote strategy department of your startup or your enterprise needs to pay attention to this. Everyone in the organization needs to be aware of this. And I think just like how the German army empowered lower level troops to make decisions on the battlefield, when you're in business, you can't have like just the strategy department figure this out. You can't have the strategy department in Kodak, business, which was a Fortune 100 business that went out of business because their strategy department sort of knew digital photography was coming along, but the individual people working in it weren't empowered to do anything about it, and they went out of business.
So Neil, it's funny. We're using the concept of war as a metaphor, but in point of fact, we know that it wasn't just a metaphor. That the set of techniques, the organizational methodologies that people like IBM and Kodak used were lifted directly from the set of techniques that won World War II. The organizational approaches that were developed in the process of fighting and winning World War II were then applied across the entire social field. It was used to build the interstate highway system. It was used to build NASA. It was used to build IBM and Kodak.
But since then, we've had, the Vietnam War, where the North Vietnamese, used, guerrilla warfare techniques and distributed attacks, and they used, they managed to get inside the American decision loop. And, they, even though they were losing the last war, they won the current war.
Yes, quite right. Yeah, so this notion of a decision loop, or as the John Boyd, who's the American strategic theorist who came up with the concept, the OODA loop, OODA loop, is, I think, a concept that is very timely, and I think more and more people are going to begin grasping it. So would it be useful to try to define it more rigorously right now?
Absolutely. What does OODA stand for those who've never come across it?
All right, so this is actually, as I mentioned, I think it's a very, very deep concept, and frankly, I think even the practitioners in the military who use it don't understand it well enough. So the idea is that the first O is observe, and we can think of observe as your capacity, which might be your organization or your team or your individual capacity, to pull information in from the universe. And by the way, your intuitive channel is part of that methodology. The more you're able to actually process things intuitively, the more bandwidth your O has. The second O is orient. The idea is that just being overwhelmed by a flood of information is not helpful. You have to actually be able to take that and turn that from information into meaning. So orientation is your capacity to make sense of what's coming in. And so if we're going to be tuning into our intuitive channel, we have to get better and better at listening to it and using it as a guide to then be making decisions, which is the third, the D, decide. Right? So decisions is taking sense and connecting sense to our action potentials. It's the bridge between what we perceive as being going on and how we are going to actually respond to it. Deciding is the narrowing function that then hands off to act. And the action piece, of course, is the agentic, the actuator, the refined ability that we have to express our energies into the world with the most impact, with the least effort, and with the least amount of externalization effects, the least sort of unanticipated consequences.
So
and the idea that Boyd has is the loop.
So what's the loop? You observe, orientate, decide, act, and then you repeat it all over again?
Right, because it's sort of reality or the universe outside of you comes in through observe and then exits through some kind of expression, some action or some change of behavior that you make in the world, which changes the state of the world, which then you observe. And interestingly enough, the common knowledge has it that the fastest OODA loop wins. And this is actually not true. The better understanding is that the OODA loop with the highest bandwidth wins, meaning that the one that can handle the most through it the fastest will win. Certain circumstances, having a very narrow band OODA loop, very rapid, is highly effective. But generally speaking, what you want to be able to do is be able to perceive, process, decide on, and act with the most potential in the shortest amount of time.
And at the same time, you want to slow down your opponent and cut their bandwidth.
Yes. So then in the game of strategy, if you are in fact interacting with other OODA loops, which we generally are, if you can do things to slow down or reduce the bandwidth of your opponent's OODA loop, then that's the other side of the equation, right? So net, the OODA loop with the highest bandwidth will win in any strategic contest. And so either you can increase yours or decrease your opponent.
So in business, we're observing what our competitors are doing. We're observing what is shifting in the technology and organizational technology. We're orientating ourselves as to where we're going to focus. We're deciding what we're going to do. We're taking action, changing a product, launching a new service, reorganizing our business a different way. And then we're repeating it and doing it over again. And then if we're a little devious, we're also trying to slow down our opponents or cutting down their bandwidth by cutting the amount of information they have available, or exploiting the fact that they just don't process information so quick because maybe they have a hierarchical structure and they, only the top people in the organization do any of this and all the bottom people don't. Whereas in our organization, everyone's empowered to observe, orientate, and decide and act, and take decisions and move the business forward and get feedback. And that ability for the organization to make decisions quickly and change and maybe not have a coherent strategy, but in Zappo's shoes, the customer service representatives are empowered to decide what's best for the customer, right? They don't have to take it up the hierarchy to find out what to do. They have a faster OODA loop to decide what to do that. And then this is part of the fact that the organization doesn't seem to have a consistent, strategy, but they make fast decisions that are good for their customers, could be confusing to the opposition because they don't quite know what they're doing, but they seem to be doing it better, right? That's a way to slow down their bandwidth because you're giving off so many different signals, they don't know what to focus on.
So there's a couple of really interesting things that are implicit because you use the phrase not having a coherent strategy. And what's amazing about that is the degree to which we have, because we grew up in the latter half of the 20th century broadly, we have mapped the word strategy to actually mean a strategic plan in the bureaucratic hierarchical mode, right? The kind of thing that a strategic planning organization creates, which is then disseminated. Boyd's point is that
is how World War II was won, right? That's
exactly
the strategy that all the big companies copied out of World War II, that you have a hierarchy, you have a strategy, you use operational research techniques to optimize your strategy, but the individual soldiers just follow what they're told to do.
Right, and Boyd's point is that if you understand that OODA loop, the engineering a higher bandwidth OODA loop is strategy, that actually is what strategy really is, and that the approach that you just described quite well is an approach that optimizes an OODA loop for the environment of the 1950s to the late 1970s, 80s, like that's the deep insight. And so now that we're not in the 1980s, using the techniques of the 1980s and fighting the last war, so the question is, what is in fact the nature, the essence of actual strategic thinking and planning that is appropriate for a networked age?
And in my view, it's probably more distributed. It's probably people accessing their intuition as well as their rational mind.
Yeah.
And probably some other things I haven't even considered yet.
Well, I mean, we could take a couple of things that are more legible, which is, for example, the changing nature of supply chain. The ability to do logistics, outsource logistics, the ability to do very, very rapid experimental marketing through digital marketing and social media. Like, these are just very tactical handheld techniques that effectively everybody's familiar with. And what these changes in the economic framework have done in the past several decades is they've enabled and also forced a shrinking of the nature of what the firm looks like. So instead of having to have ownership of my logistical function to be able to ship from where I am to where my customer is, I can outsource my logistical function to, and actually at this point, almost a cloud logistical function. I don't even know who's shipping my stuff anymore. I just provide it to a shipping service who makes sure that it gets to the end customer at effectively commodity cost. I no longer have to have a giant IT department that builds out my hosting and bandwidth function. I just outsource that to Amazon Web Services or to Google, and they optimize that. So what ends up happening is that my firm is empowered to shrink and become more and more focused on a smaller core competency, which then becomes a fluid component of a different kind of marketplace. And if I don't do that, if I sort of hold on to competencies that are not my core, I'm actually radically less capable than everybody around me, which is to say that my OODA loop is very slow because now I'm doing things that are obsolete. That Google has already fully optimized, and why the hell am I doing that? They've already done it perfectly. We just plug into what they're doing and take advantage of that. So this notion that the organizational structure, as you said, like the way the Wehrmacht reorganized and pushed authority out to a different class of soldiers, which meant that the higher ranks also had a different way of doing planning. The new organizational structure is going to be oriented around smaller groups that have very intense core competencies that find ways to then ally with and link with other equally small groups who have intense core competencies and to actually share their energy and their resources in a very fluid and very rapidly changing global marketplace.
And those teams may be fluid themselves. It may be there's a team this month to deal with a particular issue and succeed there, and then it disbands or reorganizes and the people move to different teams. There may not be a permanent structure.
I'm noticing that in my own company.
Oh, well, cool. And this is actually an idea that was used in, I think it was Lockheed Martin in their Skunk Works, which, they wanted to come up with some new technology to sell to the Army or the Air Force. And the traditional big hierarchical organization wasn't coming up with it. And they locked up these really clever engineers and gave them some budget, and they came up with some really new technology because they were separated from the rest of the organization. But I think that idea is going to invade the whole organization. We're going to have everything is going to be a skunk works. Everything will be creating amazing new inventions, but doing it in a temporary way for whatever needs doing in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the challenge for people who think organizationally is going to be figuring out where the efficient frontier is. So it's unlikely that we'll be in a position where everybody has to be a stem cell, meaning that everybody has to sort of carry the full portfolio of capacities and skills. That doesn't seem likely to be efficient. There still needs to be division of labor and specialization, but it's certainly the case that the amount of division of labor and specialization is going to be a lot less than it was in the 1950s and 60s. And this notion of fluid recombinations of groups of individuals that cohere around some particular set of functions, optimize for it in a time frame where the optimization is valid, produce an artifact, flow it into the marketplace, and then maybe even disappear and recohere, more like the studio model. That's certainly being explored quite rapidly. And of course, we're living in an environment that, while it is changing very rapidly, there are also sort of forces of viscosity. Companies like, say, Microsoft or Lockheed Martin, who, because they control enough power, they have enough resources and enough influence over the environment, that they are trying to keep the niche. They're trying to keep the world conducive to their way of being. That you have these very interesting dynamics between the rate at which the past is fading and the rate at which the future is emerging. And as an entrepreneur, being able to flow in there. If your business is going to be interfacing with healthcare companies, like health insurance companies, that's going to require a very unique dynamic of connecting what you and I are talking about with dinosaurs. Like how do you actually interface with dinosaurs when you're a mammal? Or conversely, do you just go ahead and decide to become a pure play mammal and just launch something like 23andMe or Fitbit that goes straight to the end user and completely routes around the legacy infrastructure? And this maybe actually leads us all the way back to the initial conversation, which is the situational assessment with the state of what's happening in the world right now.
Well, and I want to recommend people read that because although it's written geared towards political talk, you can reread the whole article as applied to what's going on in business. And there's, just if we're okay swimming a little bit deeper in the swimming pool of ideas here into deeper water, I hope we haven't drowned too many listeners so far. And then I promise we'll come back to shallow water for some actions that would make sense. Is that okay with you, Jordan? So I think one of the things I got from your situational assessment is that there is a world culture war going on. And I kind of labeled it, World Culture War II, a bit like World War II. But the thing is, unlike World War II, which, in the 1940s, I think most people knew World War II was actually going on. But just imagine you were an entrepreneur back then and you didn't even know there was a war. And you had your factory or business and you were going along and you were wondering, well, why aren't my employees working so good? And why has suddenly half my factory disappeared? I didn't even know bombs existed, Can you imagine how disruptive that would be for your business if you didn't even know the war was going on? And on the flip side, what an opportunity. Suppose you knew, there is a war going on and I could retool the business to help out my country in whatever way that could happen. Or however you adjust to it. Maybe you decided, I'm going to relocate my business to Latin America because I don't think that's going to be involved in this particular war. Many ways you could take it. But if you don't even know the world culture war is going on, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah, well, the example that just keeps coming home for me, because I lived it, was I didn't know that a global scale financial crisis was going on in 2007. I was along the ride with virtually everybody else, and it was. And if I had known, obviously I would have been able to make vastly better decisions. So the notion that we're currently immersed deeply in a culture war, and I think it is a world culture war, and that it's very difficult to understand because it's not at all like the culture war of the 60s. Some of it is
so the 60s were World Culture War I in this terminology?
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. In fact, it may even be that there may actually be more than just a metaphor there. That may actually be a very close mapping. The 60s and 70s was World Culture War I, and to a greater or lesser extent, certainly in the West, in Western Europe, the United States, Japan, China, the Middle East sort of were a little bit shifted on that. And what was happening now is that the kind of the ripple effects of what happened in the West and what happened in the rest of the world are beginning to realign in what seems like a single world culture war II. And what's happening is a number of different elements are aligning. So if we think about culture, it's not just being stuff like the prosaic stuff like fashion or the ideas that are having valence, or politics. We really think about culture as the nature of how we go about as individuals and groups making sense of the world, making sense of our identity, who we are, making sense of who we work with and how and why in terms of purpose, and then acting. Culture is a big piece of the framework of how we go about building our individual and group OODA loops. And what's happening right now is that big waves are pushing through global cultures, and they are disrupting all of the old ways of doing this. And they are giving rise to entirely new ways of doing it. So it's very akin to a very rapid shift from a jungle to a desert. And so what's happening is that there are surface artifacts. Like, for example, in the United States, we have this surface sense that there is some kind of red Republican Trump thing that we may map to saying, oh, it's the Republicans that we remember from the 1980s versus the Democrats that we remember from the 1980s. But that's actually not, I don't think, what's really happening. What's really happening, I think, is that there's more profound transitions that are going on under the surface, and that what I call the red religion or the insurgency, the Trump insurgency, have begun to form entirely new OODA loops, entirely new forms of collective intelligence that are more closely in alignment with the nature of the transformations that are going on below the surface, and in many ways only superficially resemble the Republicans of the Reagan era. If you actually sort of just did a straight semantic mapping, it's not particularly close. They just are kind of wearing that clothing because that just happens to be where they're able to get above the surface, but they're pulling some other new kind of cultural coherence driven by a more adaptive response to what's going on underneath the surface. And then so by contrast, this thing that I call the establishment and the blue church, which are related but not exactly the same, which the Democratic Party certainly is still closely connected with, they're fighting the last war. And this is one of the reasons why they're losing, in spite of the fact that they have a huge amount of resources, that they're doing something which is, in some sense, swimming against the current of these big changes that are going on underneath the surface. And one of these big changes is technical. Right? The shift from television and newspaper to the internet is a major shift, and the blue church is perfectly optimized for television and newspapers and is completely maladapted to social media. By contrast, the red religion, which is, again, not the Republicans of the Reagan era, is in many ways the consequence of social media, more so than even adapted to it, is an expression of social media that has begun to grasp means and cohere those means into what feels a little bit like something like a narrative that is now beginning to outcompete the blue church in this new emergent environment.
And this is somewhat analogous to the Vietnam War, where the American and South Vietnamese were fighting the last war. They had incredible, superiority in numbers of bombs and tanks and what have you. And they had an organization based on the World War II kind of model that won World War II. But the North Vietnamese and the Viet Minh, they had a more nimble approach that had a faster OODA loop. And, they were able to totally destroy that, even though the establishment looked like they should have won.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's important to recognize, for example, for anybody who wants to kind of get deeper into the actual history, the degree to which the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong were able to play with and connect with disruptive forces inside the American social cultural fabric, right? Because that was degrading the OODA loop of the establishment, is also very much an important piece of the story when you're playing that kind of game.
So that cultural war is happening right now in America and in Western society, because it's not just in America. This is a symptom of the BritX and the other things going on in different countries.
Right.
And, if we don't understand this war is going on, it's entirely possible our business might get, collateral damage from what's happening.
Yes. I would say with absolute certainty. The magnitude of this is way too large to not have collateral effects on all businesses, certainly businesses above a certain order of magnitude in size. What's interesting is because this is so big, it will actually tend to affect really big companies like, say, Google, who otherwise would be largely unaffected because they're strong enough to kind of hold. Even the biggest companies are going to be affected by this, which is one of the reasons why they're starting to get very nervous.
I think this is something really important for people to grasp. Let's go back to the shallow end of the pool. What are some concrete actions you'd recommend people taking to take opportunity from this cultural war or to protect their assets?
Well, a lot of that, of course, depends on where you're positioned in the world. What we can say for certain is a couple of things. The first is that people are going to be attending to these issues. So if your business is a business that relates to individuals' psychology, their sense of safety, their sense of well-being, their sense of being empowered, there's, in some sense, obvious opportunities that emerge there, some of which are going to be sort of unfortunate abilities to exploit people, which I would recommend people avoid, but many of which are, in fact, going to be absolutely necessary mechanisms to help people find ways to respond to what is absolutely going to be an increasingly chaotic and increasingly intensely distressful environment. Things are going to make less and less sense and seem more and more dangerous over the next several years. And so if your business is something that can help people respond to that, and it can be anything, right? It can be yoga. It can be personal development techniques. It can be ways to get people to interact with other people in physical lived space. It can be more effective pathways to personal nutrition, which makes the body more able to respond to its environment. A very large number of ways that you can tap into that. That's one set of vectors. Second, because we can say with some confidence that the macro environment is going to become more turbulent, so think of this like boiling water and turbulence, being able to construct your business organization deeply around a fundamental ability to respond to increasingly rapid and unpredictable change will enable you to radically outcompete even vastly more well-resourced businesses that are slow to respond. So really being able to grok this idea of what it means to have a high bandwidth OODA loop, which has, for example, low dependencies. So having a limited amount of commitment to cash flow. So if you have, for example, a choice between hiring a full-time staff or enabling it to, connecting with some studio model where you have some sort of expertise that can come in, that if you have to turn it off tomorrow, you can. The latter is a more rational choice than the former. To the degree possible, allowing the ambient environment to give you very rapid feedback. So there's a premium in the contemporary environment to not being delusional. By that I mean, so for example, special forces, people who are day traders, certain emergency physicians tend to be the kinds of people who are actually rather quite aware of what's going on right now, because the business they're in, the lifestyle that they're in, requires them to not make a lot of shit up and believe their own nonsense. They just have to, because reality will very quickly tell them they were wrong. Being able to build in yourself a capacity to very rapidly be able to just test, experiment, allow reality to tell you what's happening and then respond to that, as opposed to trying to create a narrative that makes sense of reality, which may in fact be a delusion, and distracts you from reality. It's another deep core competency. So for example, this might mean instead of investing in a long cycle marketing plan that is based upon a whole bunch of untested hypotheses that may take a year before you get any signal back, and the world, it may have been a perfectly valid plan by the time you launched it. By the time the signal comes back, the world may have changed. Focus on finding ways to do things at a very rapid iteration. You can get a very rapid feedback from the world to tell you what things are going in a certain direction, and then respond to that, and then iterate again quickly. Would, for example, be a way to be adapted to the contemporary environment.
And a perfect example of that is the 7-day startup movement, where you get the whole startup and get to a proof of concept with a prototype within 7 days, in order to get feedback as to whether you should modify it and continue it, or whether you should scrap it and do something else. So, and then we can talk about all kinds of other ones. If you're in a space where being a very effective, what the heck is this called? Like the little fish that clean the teeth of the sharks. Because of the big guys are now going to get shaken up like crazy, and they're not going to be able to respond effectively internally because it requires a change in the nature of who they are. There will be a substantial amount of opportunity that opens up around facilitating bigger guys. So B2B plays that help large companies be more responsive to the contemporary environment, whether these are old-fashioned consulting gigs or finding places where big companies are not doing a good job and intense tool around that. There will be opportunity there as well, for as long as those companies survive, and being positioned to actually eat market share that falls off of large companies that are becoming less and less adapted to the environment is sort of a fundamental strategy. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, Jordan. I'm going to include the link to your article there. Is there any other way people can find you if they're interested in this stuff?
Well, I mean, if they're all interested, I actually have co-founded a couple of companies. The one that I'm in the offices in right now is actually called the Neurohacker Collective. And frankly, it's premised on a lot of the ideas that we're talking about. So it might be an interesting case study to see how I myself go about trying to execute on some of the ideas that I'm talking about.
Fabulous. Well, good luck navigating all these changes in the culture wars and all those OODA loops and accessing your intuition as a way to get faster on the decision making in your loop. And I'll look forward to seeing future situational assessments as all this unfolds.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Get strategies and show notes at intuitiveleadershipmastery.com. What would it take to see you here next time on the Intuitive Leadership Mastery Podcast?